I don't know if you remember Edward Snowden, and he came forward with all these files about what the NSA was doing, and he said, this is turnkey totalitarianism. And I woke up the morning after the election, I said, are they going to turn the key? Right? Because that is terrifying. And so what I decided to do was call dissidents in other authoritarian regimes and say, what do we need to be prepared for? I started calling all these dissidents, and I realized that there was more to their stories. I mean, obviously, than just how to protect yourself. And in fact, many of them told me like part of doing this is knowing that you can't protect yourself, but you do it anyways. And so you can take some reasonable measures. And so that's why this piece became more than just how to protect yourself, but really how to effectively challenge an authoritarian regime. And it turns out there are lots of techniques out there and that have been proven to work. Now, past success is never an indication of the future success, but it's actually kind of a hopeful story that authoritarian regimes can be challenged, have been challenged successfully over and over and over history. One of the things I thought was most surprising in my journey into understanding protest movements was that the value of street protest is actually in assuring other people that there are people who have the same beliefs. I didn't quite understand that before. I thought the protest itself on the street was its own thing, which it is. But really, movement organizers told me over and over again, the reason you do that is to make other people realize, oh, the doubts I'm having, other people share those concerns too, and ignite what they call a belief cascade so that you realize, oh, it's okay to have this belief because other people have this belief. And so the turnout for these things is in some ways just gives people more permission to say, oh, you know what? I don't want to comply with these immoral, unjust things that are being asked of me and of our nation, right? And so essentially what I learned is that the movements succeed when they are broad-based and have a huge amount of participation. There's this rule, the 3.5% rule, which is if you get 3.5% of the population to do sustained non-cooperation with the regime, which can be an economic strike, boycotts, protests, etc. That is what essentially most regimes cannot withstand that, and they fall. And so the question is, how do you get to 3.5%? You convince people that they can be part of it. And so no kings and things like that are a way to say, hey, there's a lot of other people who feel this way. Let's all act together. But it takes more than just a day of street protest. It really takes the most powerful way to withdraw consent from a regime is to actually have people not cooperate with its orders. So, for instance, you saw that like in some of these agencies, when Doge shows up illegally, the employees will stand at the door and say, you can't come in, right? The Librarian of Congress was illegally fired. And when the president installed a new one illegally, the employees said, no, you can't come in, right? These acts of non-cooperation, I will not comply with immoral, illegal acts, are how you deny a regime the ability to operate. And so the more and more of those that happen, the more effective ineffective the regime becomes, and the more that people can regain power. What the things people want are due process. They want rule of law. They want the Constitution to be followed. And so I think that is the kind of message that brings in a big tent, right? You don't have to be against this particular president, whatever. This isn't a personality thing. This is about our country. We all agreed on this document, decided we were into it, and like we want to follow it. I was recently in Poland and it was Constitution Day. They have a celebration. Everybody stopped work and all day they were gathered in squares singing songs about their constitution. And I thought, gosh, we should do that because we're so personality driven, right? But actually, when you listen to the people who have defected from the Republican Party, that's what they're saying. They're saying we want the things that are in there. We want free speech. We want due process. We want all the things that we all agreed upon, you know? And so I think that is the message we need to all have as a big umbrella for this movement to really what we all want is our rights. Thing really is to build coalitions. So if you're a group and you're doing great, find another group, join forces, then get another group, right? And like the bigger the tent, the better. And so ultimately, these movements are all about the broadest tent. There's a line in building where they say, if you're not in coalition with people you hate, you are not in coalition, right? So you must be in a group with people who you actually despise. So go find some people you despise and get in community with them. But I think the type of training I want to talk about is how to uh, engage in nonviolent protest because the data shows that violent actions are half as effective as nonviolent. And nonviolent protest is really the gold standard for achieving your aims. Uh, as we've seen, accusations that the protesters were violent were why the president called the Marines to LA. Those were unfounded allegations, but the reality is any amount of violence allows the state to justify its repressive tactics. And so the reason nonviolence is an effective tactic is because it reveals the state repression for what it is. It that asymmetry of them pointing guns and wearing all these masks and these harmless unarmed people not resisting is the image that turns people against the state. That's how you get to 3.5%. You show people how the state is acting. And so the fact that witnesses videotaped those things is so important, right? One thing that's really important thing that all of us can do is witnessing. So there's a lot of groups out there in across the country who are really just seeking to witness ICE actions and to film them because that is the most important thing to prove to the public the injustice that's happening. Learning how to be nonviolent when somebody is enacting violence on you is actually quite difficult. And so in the civil rights era, they had really impressive training to learn how to not respond. You know, obviously Gandhi in India also was like a master of this. And this is something, a technique that we are going to have to learn again because it's clear that the way this information war is going to happen about is that the protesters are violent, and so nonviolent trainings are happening all around, and they're really important for people who are going to go to street protest. If you're going to do other types of actions like economic boycotts and things like that, it's not as important. Although they are trying to make those illegal too. But but it is important to understand how to engage in these types of activities because we are not well versed in them. I think that there's a little bit of a misconception that if you don't do anything, then you're not at risk. And if you do something, you are at risk. But we are all at risk, right? If all of our rights are gone, if due process is no longer the case, everyone and anyone can be disappeared, right? Right now, they're targeting the most vulnerable people, immigrants, some of whom don't have papers, right? That's the easiest, right? But we know that when states get into repression, they are going to take people who are political dissidents. They're going to take their political enemies. They're going to take journalists. They're going to take anyone who wants to say something that they don't want said. And so the reality is that people make a little risk calculation like, oh, I'm going to be fine if I just keep my head down. But you're really not because you're going to be living in a police state. And that's not a fine way to live. And so I think one of the things is if we all can take a small risk now, everyone takes a little risk, we can prevent that bigger risk in the future. But that's a really hard thing for Americans because that is about collective action. That's about thinking of yourself as part of a collective. And we are in a cult of individuality, right? That's one of the things that makes America great and terrible. And so we have to recognize that this is a moment for thinking collectively, that if we each take a small risk honestly, like for instance, I know it's inconceivable, but a general strike is the gold standard. That is the thing that regimes cannot withstand, right? The Polish solidarity movement is considered the peak because the way they turned on the general strike, they would shut down the country. And then when the regime gave them what they wanted, they turn it back on. And then they backtrack, they turn it off again, right? And that actually is a really effective tactic, but it requires coordination and collective action and everyone taking a small risk together. And so I think that's the kind of thinking that I think Americans need to start thinking about more because you're taking a risk either way. And one of them is a little more short term, one's longer term. But in the end, nobody wants to live in a police state. Some principles that are really important in keeping yourself safe. One of the most important principles is compartmentalization. So, if you're a federal worker or you need to have a personal phone and a work phone, you need those devices to be separate. Same thing with your computers, because if there's going to be an unjust investigation of you for your total right to free speech, you want only your work devices to be swept up in that and your personal devices to be separate. And the time to do that is before you're investigated, because once you're investigated, you can't set up two regimes. So I have a lot of friends who unfortunately have been swept into such investigations and didn't do the compartmentalization and are regretting it. So that is item one. Item two is it's really important to understand use encryption. So basically, if you don't use Signal or WhatsApp, which are encrypted messaging programs, you need to start doing that right now with all of the people that you're communicating with. One thing that's really important when you're talking about leaking to journalists, if you see something that you think a journalist needs to see, you need to take a picture of it using the camera inside the Signal app. If you take it on your phone camera, there will be a photo of it on your camera roll. If you take it inside Signal, there's no trace. And then you just send that directly through Signal to the reporter whose Signal you have. Almost every reporter these days is putting their Signal ID in their bio or something. And so you can find it and just send them a photo of a document and then set that chat to disappearing messages of 1 week. And then that's it. So there are some best practices out there that I want to encourage people to use, which is compartmentalize your data, encrypt your data, don't leave any traces behind. Now, that said, there are a lot of people who say, you know what? I don't want to hide anything. I want it to be in the open. The Soviet dissidents refused to keep anything secret, published everything. That's also fair. Navalny, similarly, right? Alexei Navalny, who unfortunately was murdered by the Russian regime recently, but he also believed, you know what? I don't want to have secrets. But he wasn't stupid. He carried a burner phone. He had no data on it, right? So you have to always be smart about how thinking through these strategies. And the sad thing is that, you know, we're all going to be dissidents eventually because by speaking of it, this is a regime that has made it clear that if you oppose them, you are an enemy, right? And so anyone who has a disagreement with a government, I can't think of a single government that I haven't had a disagreement with, right? Left, right, center, whatever. So we're all going to be dissidents. So it's important to start thinking strategically about just compartmentalizing some of that of your political dissent into encrypted channels, trusted people,